I remember the moment I opened our joint bank statement and felt my stomach drop. It was one of those gut-wrenching moments that hit you like a ton of bricks. My husband Mark had been sending thousands of dollars to his family, leaving our finances in ruins. I had always suspected he favored them over us, but now I had proof. The kids needed new shoes, and I could barely afford groceries. I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders knowing that with his family coming to visit for the holidays, I had to confront him. I set a deadline. I would talk to him before they arrived, or I would take drastic steps. I couldn't allow this to go on any longer. The thought of his family arriving, expecting the usual warm welcome while I was drowning in bills, made my blood boil. They had no idea how hard I worked to keep the household running, while Mark funneled our money away from us. I was done being the silent supporter. It was time to stand my ground. Every dollar he sent them felt like a stab in the back. I was left to juggle the kids' needs and our household expenses alone while he played the hero to his family. The holidays were supposed to be a time of joy, but all I could think about was the financial mess Mark was creating. I knew I was right to confront him. This was about more than just money. It was about respect, about being valued as his partner. I had let this go on for too long, and I was finally ready to take a stand. As I stared at the bank statement, I felt a fire ignite within me. I was no longer going to be the passive wife, the one who just accepted whatever came her way. I was going to demand accountability and put my family first. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the conversation that could change everything. The kids deserved a stable home, and I was determined to fight for that, even if it meant tearing down the false image of a perfect family that Mark had built around himself. For years, I had been the dutiful wife, managing the household while Mark's family reaped the benefits of his earnings. Every birthday of his sister came with expensive gifts, while our children often received hand-me-downs. I found receipts for dinners I never attended, all marked with his family's names. Mark always insisted it was just family help, but it felt more like a betrayal. The financial strain was palpable. Our credit card bills were piling up, and I could feel the weight of those numbers pressing down on my chest. I remember one specific instance when I discovered a receipt for a fancy dinner out with his family. It was for a restaurant I couldn't even afford to take our kids to. I felt suffocated by the reality that while I was scrimping and saving, he was treating them like royalty. I couldn't help but think, what about us? What about our family? It was as if I was invisible, and all that mattered was his mother and siblings. Every holiday season it was the same song and dance. Mark would come home with stories of how he helped his family, how they needed him. I'd smile and nod, pretending to be supportive, but inside I was boiling. I never saw a dime of that money, and it was evident in our day-to-day struggles. The kids needed new shoes, but I couldn't afford them. I had to make excuses for why their friends had the latest sneakers while they were left with shoes that barely fit. I felt like I was living a lie, trapped in a situation that was designed to keep me quiet. Mark would remind me that family was important, that we should support each other. But what about my family? The kids deserved to feel secure, to know that mom and dad were working together for their future. I felt like I was fighting an uphill battle, and it was exhausting. I started to notice how Mark's family treated me. They would call me to ask for favors or to see how things were going, but when it came to support or understanding, they were nowhere to be found. It became painfully clear that I was just a means to an end for them. I was the one who held everything together, but they saw me as a burden. They expected me to be grateful for the scraps that were left while Mark lavished them with attention and money. The emotional toll was heavy. I felt like I was drowning in resentment and anger. I had tried to address the issue with Mark before, but it always ended in arguments, with him dismissing my concerns. "You don't understand how family works, Sarah," he would say, as if my feelings didn't matter. I felt like I was screaming into a void, and each time I brought it up, I was met with more hostility. The financial strain was only getting worse. I was juggling bills, trying to make ends meet while he was off playing the hero. I couldn't remember the last time I felt secure. I cringed every time I saw the credit card statements piling up. I felt like I was trapped in a cycle of dependency, and it was suffocating. I knew I had to confront him about the favoritism and the imbalanced financial support. How much longer could I pretend this was okay? I was tired of feeling like a ghost in my own home while he prioritized his family over ours. It was time to hold him accountable, and make him realize the impact of his decisions. I couldn't keep living like this, and I wouldn't. The kids deserved so much better than this dysfunctional arrangement. So I steeled myself for the upcoming confrontation. I would gather all the evidence I needed to make my case. I would show him how his actions affected our family. I was done being the dutiful wife who turned a blind eye. I would demand respect, and I would make sure he understood the consequences of his choices. It was time for a change. The breaking point came one evening when I overheard Mark on the phone. He was laughing with his mother, discussing how they would all be coming for a lavish dinner, and he casually mentioned he was taking care of everything. I stood there frozen in place, my heart racing as I realized I was nothing more than a background character in his life, a mere footnote in his story. He was planning to use our savings for their festivities, while I struggled to put food on the table. The anger and betrayal coursed through me like a wildfire, igniting a fierce determination I didn't know I had. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach as I listened to him chatter away. It was almost as if he was proud of his ability to prioritize them over our own family. The kids needed new shoes, and here he was, throwing money around like it was nothing. I could hear the laughter on the other end of the line, and it made me feel like I was suffocating. With each word he spoke, I felt a part of me breaking, and it snapped me into action. I couldn't allow myself to be a silent bystander in my own life any longer. I resolved that enough was enough. I wouldn't let this slide any longer. I had been patient, I had tried to be understanding, but this was beyond the pale. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation that was coming. I needed to confront him, to make him see what he was doing, and how it was ruining our family. As I replayed the conversation in my mind, it became clear that I had to be direct. I couldn't tiptoe around the issue any longer. I was tired of feeling like I was pleading for attention or validation. He needed to understand that his actions had consequences. I could no longer pretend that everything was okay while he poured out our hard-earned money to his family like it was no big deal. That night I laid awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about all the times I had let things slide, all the moments I had turned a blind eye to his favoritism. I remembered the birthday parties for his sister where I had to stretch our budget just to keep up appearances. I had always stood by him, supporting his choices, but I had reached my limit. I made a mental list of everything I wanted to say. I had to be clear and concise. I needed to express how his actions were affecting not just me, but our children as well. They were the ones who suffered when Mark prioritized his family's needs over ours. It wasn't fair for them to see their father showering his siblings with gifts while they had to make do with old clothes and hand-me-downs. It was an injustice that gnawed at me daily. The next day, as I prepared for the confrontation, I gathered my evidence. I collected receipts, bank statements, and anything else that would illustrate the financial strain we were under because of his choices. I knew I had to approach this with calmness, but deep down I felt a storm brewing. I was determined to make my voice heard, to stand my ground. I couldn't let him dismiss my concerns any longer. I spent the day going over my thoughts repeatedly, thinking about how Mark might react. Would he be angry? Would he dismiss me again? The fear of his reaction was daunting, but it paled in comparison to the anger I felt over the situation. I owed it to myself and to our children to fight back. I was prepared to risk everything to save our family. When the evening came, I felt a mix of anxiety and resolve. I waited until the kids were in bed, and then I called Mark into the living room. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. There was no turning back. I had to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. As I laid out everything I had found, I watched the surprise flash across his face. It was a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. He didn't expect me to confront him like this, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of guilt. But that quickly faded as he scoffed, dismissing my concerns. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I stood my ground, refusing to back down. "Mark, you need to choose," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Either we work on our family, or I will take legal action. I can't keep living like this." Those words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of finality. I wasn't just making a threat. I was laying down the law. I was done being the silent partner, the one who let things slide. This was my moment to reclaim my voice and fight for my family. When Mark returned home, I could feel the tension in the air. I knew I had to be calm but firm. I had spent hours preparing for this moment, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. I waited until he settled down. Then I took a deep breath and laid out everything I had found. "Mark, we need to talk," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up from his phone, a hint of annoyance on his face. "What now?" he asked, as if I was just another interruption in his day. But I pressed on. "I opened our joint bank statement today, and I found out you've been sending thousands of dollars to your family. Meanwhile, we can barely afford groceries. The kids need new shoes and I'm drowning in credit card bills. This can't keep happening." I watched his expression shift from annoyance to surprise, but I didn't give him a chance to dismiss what I was saying. "You can't keep sending money to them while we struggle. If this continues, I'm going to file for divorce and demand child support." I could see the shock in his eyes, and I held my breath, waiting for his reaction. He scoffed after a moment, rolling his eyes. "You're overreacting, Sarah. It's just family help. You don't understand how important family is to me." His words cut deep, but I didn't let it show. This was exactly what I was afraid of. His dismissal of my concerns. "Important family?" I echoed, my voice rising slightly. "What about our family, Mark? What about our kids? They are suffering because you prioritize your family over us. You need to choose, Mark. Either we work on our family, or I will take legal action. I'm done being pushed aside." He looked angry now, and I could see the gears turning in his head. This wasn't just a simple conversation. This was a reckoning, and I wasn't going to let him sidestep it. "You're being unreasonable," he shot back, his voice rising. "You want to tear our family apart over money?" I felt my heart race, but I didn't back down. "This isn't just about money. It's about respect, about being valued as your partner. You are throwing our hard-earned money away while I'm here struggling to keep everything afloat. I won't let you ignore this anymore." He stared at me, and I could see a mixture of anger and disbelief in his eyes. "You're acting like a child, Sarah. You know I'm just helping my family. They need me. Why can't you just be supportive?" His words felt like daggers. He didn't see me as his partner. He saw me as an obstacle. I felt the anger rise within me, but I took a deep breath to steady myself. I had to remain calm. "Being supportive doesn't mean ignoring our family's needs, Mark. I can't just sit back and let you ruin our finances while you play the hero for your family. This is about our kids, our future. You need to understand that." He crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "You're making a big mistake if you think I'm going to choose you over my family." That was it. I knew I had struck a chord. "You need to understand that if you can't make the right choice, I will. I will protect our children even if it means leaving you. I refuse to let this favoritism continue to ruin our family. It's not just about you anymore." I saw his anger simmering, but I stood my ground. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me any longer. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, fueling my determination. I had laid it all out on the table. The ball was in his court now, and I'd be damned if I let him turn this around on me. I was ready for whatever came next, but I knew one thing. I had taken a stand and there was no going back. As the confrontation neared, Mark's family arrived, and I felt the tension rise in the air. They expected me to play the role of the supportive wife, the one who stood by her man no matter what. But I couldn't do it this time. I was done pretending. Mark's mother, Lisa, pulled me aside almost immediately, her eyes narrowing as she leaned in closer. "You don't want to tear this family apart, do you?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "We've always helped each other. It's what family does." I felt my heart race. It was a classic manipulation tactic, and I was not going to fall for it. I could see straight through her sweet talk. They weren't concerned about me or my feelings. They were worried about losing the financial support they had grown so accustomed to. They wanted to keep their grip on Mark, and I was just a speed bump in their path. "Lisa, this isn't about tearing the family apart. This is about protecting my own family," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. I didn't want to escalate things in front of everyone, but I also needed her to understand that I was no longer going to be a doormat. She scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "You need to be more understanding. Mark is just being a good son. We've always helped each other out. Why can't you see that?" I took a step back, feeling a mix of anger and resolve. This was the same old song and dance. Mark's family always played the victim while they manipulated him to get what they wanted. I could feel my anger bubbling over. You know what? I've been understanding for far too long. I've stood by while Mark has prioritized you all over our family. You don't see how it affects our kids, do you? I shot back, my voice steady. Lisa's expression shifted. She looked offended, as if I had just slapped her. How could you say that? We're family. We help each other. You're being unreasonable, Sarah. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, but I was committed to my stance. I wouldn't let them manipulate me into feeling guilty anymore. I felt a familiar strength building inside me. I had been pushed around for too long, and I wasn't about to back down now. What's unreasonable is expecting me to support a system that neglects our own children. You want to talk about family? Well, family should come first. That includes our kids, Lisa. They deserve better than this. I could see Lisa's face redden with anger, and it only fueled my determination. I was standing up for my children, and I wouldn't let anyone intimidate me into silence. As the evening progressed, Mark was busy in the kitchen, blissfully unaware of the tension building in the living room. The family dinner was chaotic, filled with laughter and chatter, but I felt like a ghost watching from the sidelines. All eyes were on me as the family began to reminisce about all the expensive gifts and dinners Mark had provided for them. They expected a cheerful response from me, but I felt my heart sink. Remember that trip to the lake house last summer? One of his cousins chimed in. Mark really went all out for us. Laughter filled the room, and I felt the heat rise in my cheeks again. This was a trap. They wanted me to crack under pressure. I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of my limits. I wouldn't be their scapegoat any longer. As they continued to talk about their lavish vacations and gifts, I felt a storm brewing inside me. I was tired of being the only one in this family who cared about our finances. It was as if they were all in on a joke that I wasn't a part of. They wanted me to smile and nod to play along with their charade, but I couldn't do it. Finally, when I could take it no longer, I stood up, cutting through the laughter. I won't be part of this charade any longer. You all need to understand that I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice steady and resolute. The room fell silent and I could feel all eyes on me. I had said the words out loud, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a rush of liberation wash over me. I was no longer the silent partner, the one who stood by while Mark poured money into his family. I was taking control of my life and my children's future. I walked out of the room, leaving them to deal with the mess they had created. I felt free, knowing that I had finally stood up for myself and my family. The chaos that ensued behind me was their problem now, not mine. The family dinner was chaotic, with all eyes on me as I sat quietly at the table. Mark was in the kitchen, preparing their favorite dishes, blissfully unaware of the tension that was building in the living room. I could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of expectations pressing down on my shoulders. I was supposed to be the supportive wife, the one who cheered him on, but I couldn't go along with it anymore. I was tired of pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. As everyone chatted and laughed, I felt like I was on the outside looking in. They were exchanging stories about their last vacation, about the expensive gifts Mark had bought for them. I could hear the laughter erupting from the other end of the table, and with each chuckle my irritation grew. They wanted me to join in to celebrate Mark's generosity, but I found it hard to muster even a polite smile. Remember that time Mark rented that fancy cabin for us? One of his cousins said, her eyes sparkling with delight. He really knows how to treat his family right. More laughter followed and I felt heat creeping up my neck. I was sitting there, feeling like a fool while they marveled at Mark's spending habits, oblivious to the fact that I was struggling to pay our bills. This was a trap. They were trying to manipulate me into feeling small. They wanted me to crack to show how upset I was, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. As they reminisced about the lavish dinners and extravagant gifts Mark had provided, I felt a storm brewing inside me. I remembered the countless times I had swallowed my anger, the times I had let Mark's favoritism slide. I thought of my children and how they had to wear hand-me-downs while his siblings received new clothes every holiday. This wasn't about money. It was about respect, about being valued as a partner. Suddenly, someone at the table said, Mark really knows how to take care of his family. This was it. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of my limits. I had to put an end to this charade. I wouldn't let them use me as a scapegoat any longer. It was time to stand up for myself. With that thought in mind, I stood up, cutting through the laughter and conversations. I won't be part of this charade any longer. You all need to understand that I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice steady and resolute. The room fell deathly silent. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. I could see Mark's face pale as he stepped out of the kitchen, his hands frozen mid-motion, a ladle in one hand and a dish in the other. I had finally said the words out loud, and for the first time in a long time I felt liberated. I was no longer the silent partner, the one who accepted his financial irresponsibility. I was taking control of my life. Mark's family exchanged glances, their shock quickly transforming into anger. I could see the color rising in Lisa's face as she shot me a furious look. "How could you do this?" she exclaimed, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're tearing this family apart." I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. They didn't see their own incompetence. They only saw me as the villain. But their words only validated my decision. I stood firm, knowing that the other guests were witnessing their true colors. I could sense the tension in the air. It was thick and suffocating. I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had finally done what needed to be done. "You need to understand that this isn't just about you anymore," I said, my voice steady. "It's about our children. They deserve better than this. They shouldn't have to compete for their father's love or financial support. I won't let this continue." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and walked out, leaving them in shock and chaos. For the first time I felt free, knowing I had taken control of my life and my children's future. I wouldn't be their scapegoat any longer. The dinner that was supposed to be a celebration had turned into a battlefield, and I had chosen my side. I was done being silent. I was done being the one who always accepted less. As I stepped outside to catch my breath, I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. I had taken a stand and there was no going back. I was ready to face whatever came next, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never allow them to manipulate me again. When the time came, I knew I had to act decisively. The chaos of the family dinner was still fresh in my mind, but deep inside, I felt a surge of power. I had spoken my truth, and now it was time to follow through. I had to take control once and for all. Mark was in the kitchen, still trying to impress his family with the lavish dinner he had prepared for them. I could hear the clattering of pots and pans, and the smell of food wafted through the air, mixing with the tension that filled the room. As I sat there, I watched the family members exchange looks of confusion and disbelief. I was the outsider now, the one who had dared to disrupt their little bubble of entitlement. But I refused to back down. I had made my choice and there was no turning back. Taking a deep breath, I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of their stares upon me. My heart raced, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I won't be part of this charade any longer," I announced, my voice steady and loud enough to cut through the noise of their chatter. "You all need to understand that I'm filing for divorce." The room fell silent as if a bomb had gone off. I could see the shock etched on everyone's faces, particularly Mark's. He stepped out of the kitchen, his mouth agape, a ladle frozen in his hand. The laughter that had filled the room moments ago was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I had finally said the words out loud, and I felt a rush of liberation wash over me. I turned my gaze toward Mark, who was struggling to process what I had just declared. I could see the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but I refused to flinch. I was done being the silent partner, done accepting his financial irresponsibility and favoritism towards his family. I was taking control of my life, and I was ready for whatever came next. Mark's family began to murmur among themselves, their shock quickly morphing into anger. Lisa, his mother, was the first to react, her face reddening with rage. "How could you do this?" she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're tearing this family apart." I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness wash over me. They didn't see their own incompetence. They only saw me as the villain in their narrative. But their reaction only reinforced my decision. I stood tall, knowing that I was no longer the one who would be pushed around. "This isn't just about you anymore," I replied, my voice firm. "It's about our children. They deserve better than this." They shouldn't have to compete for their father's love or financial support. I won't let this continue. Mark opened his mouth, ready to defend himself, but I cut him off. You've made your choice, Mark. You prioritize your family over ours, and I can't stand by and let you destroy everything we've built. I refuse to be the scapegoat any longer. This is about respect, about being valued as a partner. His face twisted with rage, and I could see the anger simmering in his eyes. I had struck a nerve, and I wasn't going to let him sidestep this. The other guests watched, their expressions a mix of disbelief and intrigue, and I felt a sense of power surge through me. As the tension in the room escalated, Mark's family began to rally around him, trying to defend their beloved son. You're being unreasonable. One of his cousins shouted. Mark is just helping his family. Helping? I shot back, my voice rising. You mean draining our finances while I struggle to keep everything afloat? This isn't about family anymore. This is about your selfishness. You all sit here and expect me to applaud when he prioritizes you over our kids. That's not family, that's manipulation. Mark clenched his fists, his face contorted in anger. You're acting like a child, Sarah. You don't understand how important family is to me. Important family? I echoed, my heart racing. What about our family? What about our kids? They need their father, not just a provider who throws money around to impress you all. The tension in the room reached a boiling point, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I had finally taken a stand, and I wouldn't let them intimidate me into silence. I felt a familiar strength building inside me, a fierce determination to protect my children and myself from this toxic environment. With one final look at Mark, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them to deal with the mess they had created. The chaos that followed was their problem now, not mine. I felt free, knowing that I had finally stood up for myself and my family. I had taken control of my life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of liberation wash over me. As I stepped outside to catch my breath, I realized that I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer the silent partner, the one who accepted less. I was ready to face whatever came next, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never allow them to manipulate me again. As I stepped out of the room, feeling a rush of adrenaline, I was immediately met with the storm that was brewing behind me. Mark followed closely, his face twisted in fury. You've ruined everything, he shouted, his voice echoing in the hallway. The angry words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness wash over me. Sadness because I had hoped for some understanding, some sign that he might realize the impact of his actions. But satisfaction because I finally stood my ground and said what needed to be said. You've brought this on yourself, Mark. I shot back, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling around us. You chose to prioritize your family's needs over ours. You chose to ignore our struggles while lavishing gifts on your siblings. I can't be part of this anymore. His face grew redder, anger radiating off him in waves. How could you do this to our family? To me? He spat, his words laced with betrayal. I could see the disbelief in his eyes, the confusion that I had dared to challenge the status quo. But he didn't understand. His family had been a constant source of stress in our marriage, and I had finally reached my limit. You don't get to play the victim here, Mark. I replied, my voice rising slightly. You've been neglecting your responsibilities as a husband and a father for far too long. You think throwing money at your family will earn you their love? It won't. They'll always come first for you, and will always be second. That's not how a family should work. I could see the irritation brewing in his eyes, but I stood my ground. Mark's mother, Lisa, stormed up behind him, her expression furious. You're being selfish, Sarah. This is a family that has always supported each other. You're tearing us apart for your own insecurities. I felt a surge of anger. How dare she come at me like that? I had spent years feeling insecure, years trying to make this marriage work while constantly being sidelined. You don't get to dictate what family means to me, Lisa. You and Mark have created a toxic dynamic that I refuse to be a part of any longer. It's not about tearing anyone apart. It's about standing up for myself and my children. Lisa's face twisted in anger, and she opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. No, you need to listen. I'm done being the good wife who supports your son while he neglects our family. My children deserve better. They deserve a father who puts them first, not one who throws money around to impress his siblings. The tension in the room thickened, and I could feel Mark's frustration boiling over. "This is ridiculous. You're making a huge mistake," he shouted, his fists clenched tightly. I could see the disappointment in his eyes, but it didn't matter anymore. I had made my decision and I wasn't going to back down. "No, Mark. You're the one who's made mistakes. You've chosen your family over yours, and it's not fair to me or our kids. I've tried to support you, to understand your need to help your family, but it's always been at our expense. I won't allow it any longer." I felt the weight of my words hanging in the air, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for speaking my truth. As Mark paced back and forth, his anger radiating off him, I could see the realization dawning on him. I had finally reached my breaking point, and I wasn't going to let him manipulate me anymore. I refused to be the scapegoat for his choices. I had fought for our family for too long, and it was time to take a stand. As the chaos unfolded, I walked back to the living room, where his family was still in shock. I could feel their eyes on me, judging me, but I didn't care. I had taken control of my life, and I was ready to face whatever came next. I wouldn't be their scapegoat any longer. I had finally broken free from the chains that had held me down for so long. The dinner that was supposed to be a celebration had turned into a battleground, and I had chosen my side. I was no longer the silent partner, the one who accepted less. I was ready to fight for my children and for myself. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, and for the first time in years I felt empowered. As Mark's family began to murmur among themselves, I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. I knew I had made the right decision, but the reality of what lay ahead was daunting. I had no idea how this would all play out, but I had to trust myself. I had to believe that I would find a way to navigate the chaos that was about to unfold. "You'll regret this, Sarah," Mark shouted, his voice filled with anger and despair. But I didn't flinch. I had stood up for myself, and I wasn't going to let his threats intimidate me. I had fought for my family's well-being for too long, and now it was time to prioritize myself and my children. As I walked out of the house, I felt a sense of freedom wash over me. I was no longer bound by their expectations or their toxic behavior. I had taken control of my life, and I would face whatever challenges lay ahead with courage. I was ready to embrace this new chapter, no matter how difficult it might be. It was time to reclaim my power and find my peace. The fallout was swift and brutal. In the days that followed my confrontation, Mark found himself struggling to manage everything. He was not just losing me. He was losing the stability that came with having two incomes, and the reality of his financial decisions began to hit him hard. I could see it in the way he interacted with his family, how desperate he became to maintain their approval while simultaneously trying to keep our household afloat. First, it was almost amusing to watch. Mark had always been the golden child in his family, the one who could do no wrong. But without my support, he quickly began to unravel. He was not equipped to handle the financial strain he had created, and I could see it in the way he struggled to keep up with bills and responsibilities. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. I had spent years cleaning up after him, managing our finances, paying bills, and ensuring our children had what they needed. Now, he was left to face the consequences of his actions alone. I had freed myself from that burden, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. One evening, a mutual friend of ours, someone who had always been on the periphery of our lives, reached out to me. "Hey, I just wanted to check in on you," she said, her voice a mix of concern and curiosity. "I heard about the divorce. How are you holding up?" I appreciated the concern, but I also sensed an underlying question in her tone. She had seen how I had put up with Mark's behavior for so long. "I'm doing well, actually. It's been a relief to finally stand up for myself," I replied, trying to keep it light. She chuckled softly. I always thought he was a bit of a jerk, but I never knew how bad it really was. I can't believe you let it go on for so long." Her words struck a chord. I had often doubted myself, wondering if I was overreacting, if I was being too harsh. But hearing that acknowledgement from someone outside our toxic dynamic filled me with a sense of validation. I hadn't lost anything. Instead, I had freed myself from a burden. As the weeks went by, I began to notice changes in Mark's family dynamics. The lavish dinners and expensive gifts he had once provided became a distant memory. I heard through the grapevine how his siblings had started to complain about his inability to contribute financially as he once did. They were starting to see the cracks in their golden child's facade. At a family gathering, I learned from a friend that Mark had made a series of poor financial decisions after I left. He had attempted to impress his family with extravagant gifts, but without my income, he began to struggle. The truth began to surface. "Did you hear about Mark?" my friend asked, leaning in closer. "He's been trying to manage everything on his own, and it's not going well. People are starting to talk about how careless he's been with money." I couldn't suppress a small smile. It felt good to know I wasn't the only one who was aware of the truth. The whispers about Mark's financial mismanagement were like the universe finally bringing justice to light. I realized how important it was to surround myself with people who understood my situation and could see through the facade Mark had created. Months passed, and I found myself thriving in my new life. I secured a stable job that paid well, and I moved into a cozy apartment that felt like home. My children were happy, and I was learning to create a life for us that didn't revolve around Mark or his family. Mark, on the other hand, continued to spiral. He was still trying to blame me for all his problems, but I no longer cared. I had managed to establish boundaries, and I was unapologetically living my life. I had built a new foundation for myself and my children, one that was free from the toxic patterns that had once consumed us. I would occasionally pick up the phone to hear from Mark, but I kept the conversation strictly business. When he would start to blame me for everything that had gone wrong, I would calmly remind him that he was responsible for his choices. "You need to figure this out, Mark," I would say, my voice steady. "I'm not part of your financial decisions anymore. You'll have to manage this on your own." Each time I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. I had finally taken control of my life, and I was no longer tethered to his toxic behavior. I had chosen my freedom, and with it came a newfound sense of peace. As I looked back on the chaos that had been my life with Mark, I realized how much stronger I had become. I had learned to prioritize my needs and those of my children. I was no longer willing to sacrifice my happiness for the sake of someone else's expectations. I had broken free, and there was no turning back. When I finally found myself sitting in my new living room, sipping a cup of tea while watching my children play, I could hardly believe how far I had come. The sense of relief and peace that filled the space was palpable. I had chosen to reclaim my life, and I was ready to embrace whatever the future held. It was in that moment that I understood. I hadn't lost anything in this process. I had gained my freedom, my independence, and the peace I had longed for. The chains that had bound me to Mark and his family had been shattered, and I was ready to embrace my new normal. Months later, I had started a new life. I secured a job that paid well and found a cozy apartment for my children and me. It was everything I had dreamed of. A place where we could thrive without the suffocating weight of Mark and his family's expectations. The kids were happy, laughing and playing as I watched them from the living room, feeling a sense of peace that had been absent for so long. Mark and his family continued to spiral, still trying to blame me for their misfortunes. I would occasionally get calls from Mark, but I had learned to keep them brief and formal. "I can't discuss this with you anymore, Mark. You need to handle your own finances now," I would say, my voice steady. I felt a rush of satisfaction every time I hung up the phone, knowing I had set clear boundaries. I no longer cared what they thought of me. I had built a life without their toxicity. Each conversation felt like a reminder of how far I had come, how much I had gained by letting go. I was free from the manipulation and guilt that had kept me chained for years. On a particularly sunny afternoon, I found myself sitting on my new porch, sipping tea and listening to the laughter of my children playing in the backyard. I realized that I had finally reclaimed my power. I had chosen to prioritize my happiness and that of my children above all else. I was ready to embrace whatever the future held, confident in my strength. As I hung up the phone after yet another call, I felt a smile creep across my face. I was free, and that was the most beautiful thing of all.